This conference will now be recorded.
All right, Erica, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. I do want to start off with some introductions so we know who's here in the room, and then we can go from there. So my name's Sam Shukas. I'm the Housing Community Health Program Director here at GWRC. Erica, let's start with who we have in the office, and then we'll go to people on the phone.
Of course. So my name is Erica Dutcher, and I am the program coordinator for the CoC. And I have with me.
Good morning, I'm Sharon Glover, founder of Faith Housing Coalition.
And it's just us two in the office together.
Awesome. And Kathy Anderson.
Good morning, Kathy Anderson from the Powerhouse.
Thanks, Kathy. And Kathy Doberly.
Kathy Doberly from Fajas.
Thanks, Kathy. And Allie Names.
Hi, Allie Names from the Fredericksburg SPCA.
Perfect. Thanks, Allie. And then I have one person who called in.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jacob Ducey from Fajas. I couldn't be bothered with the GoTo app this morning because I don't know my password to download it.
No worries, Jacob. Thank you for joining us. Anyone else I missed? Okay. All right. So I am sorry that I can't be with you guys in person. I am working from home this week because by some miracle and luck, I have been diagnosed with COVID yet again this year. So I'm working from home, but if you guys need anything, you can catch me there. But we haven't done this process in about 3 years. So last time we did this presentation was during COVID when we were all isolating. So we thought it would be a good idea to put it back into the community. So this is the funding interest session. This is going to go through the CoC's process for applying for grants and funding that flows through the CoC, what that process looks like, what our role is at GWRC in that process, and then we're going to actually go through each of our funding opportunities and talk about which they provide. We hope that this is interactive. I'll go through a bunch of stuff and then we'll have questions at any point. Please put your questions in the chat. Erica's going to be watching that for us and answering any questions she can there. And then we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end. But we really hope this is helpful to you guys as you think about your projects and think about ways that the CoC can help with actually building those projects and getting those funded for you. All right, so as I mentioned, just a couple of things we're going to go over. We're going to give you a brief introduction to the whole funding process, why we do what we do and what that looks like. We will then go through how to apply and what that looks like, and then each of those funding opportunities. So just so you know who's involved in this process, I've already introduced myself. I actually oversee most of the CoC and just making sure that it flows properly, where Erica actually does the day-to-day work. So at any point, if you need anything, those are your two go-to people for the CoC. We actually rely really heavily on a funding and performance committee as well. Currently, we are recruiting for that committee, so this makeup might look a little bit different in the next month or so. But right now, we have 4 members on that committee. These are members that do not apply for funding and have but have an interest in helping the CoC make decisions on limited funding resources. So Kristen Gallick has been on our committee for a very long time. She'll actually be rolling off next year. She is with Fredericksburg Department of Social Services. And Clay Mahulides has been with the CoC in many different roles and is with us from Chrismar Realty. Emma Miller-Richards is actually moving to Australia and will be moving away from our committee, and so we have a replacement from the Community Foundation for her. And then Sarah Walsh has also been in our committee for a very long time. We'll be rolling off next year, and we're looking for a replacement for her. But those 4 people are wonderful group of people who review all of our applications and the performance of all of our projects that we do fund. And so they're our committee that we really rely on keeping up to date with how things should be funded and what our strategy is overall. So a little bit about the funding overview. GWRC, the George Washington Regional Commission, is the CoC lead agency, and as such serves as a collaborative applicant for many federal, state, and local funding sources. What collaborative applicant means is rather than each of the agencies in the community applying for funding on their own, the CoC applies as a community, writing a grant application on behalf of the community to say how all the pieces fit together, and here's how that funding will be dispersed over numerous agencies. And so this is a required process for state and federal funding, and now it's bled into some local funding towards homelessness. So we'll talk through what that process looks like and what that means, but just to give you an idea about what our actual overarching role is. For funding in particular that we're going to be talking about today, and what a majority of the CoC spends their time on, though there are some one-off things that we help with in a collaborative way. We're going to talk about the HUD CoC program funding, the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program, which is VHSP, Housing Trust Fund. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Homeless Reduction Grant, though we'll show you that there is 2 options, and then the Unsheltered Homeless Initiative, which is local funding. Some key documents for you to keep in mind as you think about applying and what you how you align your projects with the strategic plan of the CoC, which is what we're always thinking about when we figure out who to fund and who not. Is the funding priorities. So the board actually passes these every year. It's key programmatic considerations that help us figure out how to take the limited resources that we have and put them into the community. Many things in the priorities have to do with overarching philosophies such as housing first, ending homelessness for everyone, racial equity. So projects that are able to put forth and align themselves with those philosophies, we're going to fund and we're going to prioritize over others. When it comes to key programmatic considerations, think about things like increasing the number of housing units in our community for people experiencing homelessness. So we're going to prioritize projects that do that. So funding priorities are available on our website. They change every year, not drastically, but they are reviewed and changed every year. And so that helps you with knowing, what are we trying to fund most in our community. There is also an entire manual of how to apply for funding, what it looks like, what we do. That's the funding policies and procedures. So that's actually going to outline everything from how you ask for money, how we ask for money on behalf of the CoC, how you ask for a letter of support, our organizational review process, all sorts of things. So any question that you ever have about how funding decisions get made by the CoC, policies and procedures outlines that process. Eric and I are also here to answer any questions or crazy ideas that you might have, but funding policies and procedures, I think we've come to a really good place with those, and those continue to be adapted each year, meeting our needs. Just some basic funding eligibility for the people who would like to apply. You do have to be a member of the CoC. We have actually had people apply and they have not been an official member. And when I say being a member, that means you had to have filled out the member application form, and then have signed the project agreement. So there is now a second step to kind of say, this is what I'm agreeing to by being a member. So as long as you've done those two things, then you are eligible to apply for funding through the CoC. And then we actually have a coordinated entry policies. We require all people that we fund to meet this process. They have to align with this process. And what that means is you have to be housing first. And we can talk about housing first, but you have to be willing to put someone into housing as quickly as possible, not put stipulations on the requirements of a person to get that housing. So cannot require employment, cannot require sobriety, cannot require mental wellness to entry, and then you're going to wrap services around them. So it's not housing only, it's housing first. There are no requirements to get into housing or receive services, but then we are going to, make some strides towards getting you those support services that you need in order to maintain that housing. So that is required to receive funding, not necessarily to be a member, but to receive our funding. You have to participate in the coordinated process, and that's outlined in the policies and procedures, but basically you will be a part of our homeless helpline. You will be part of our prioritization process. You will be part of the CoC and work with us to help make sure that we are advocating for the most vulnerable in our community to receive the services that you're offering. We have established project standards now for every single program type that is eligible through any of our pots of funding. So there are bare minimum requirements that you have to meet for each of those projects. So as long as you're able to do that, then you kind of check that box. And then finally, you have to collect data through HMIS or a comparable database. So we use an HMIS system, which is a homeless management information system, where we collect how people flow through our system. So demographics, things about their history, things about the person, and what services they're using. The only person who's exempt from using our HMIS system is domestic violence service providers, and they use a comparable database. So they use something that asks the same questions, but for confidentiality reasons, do not put it into our database. Each of our funding sources then have eligibility requirements. So as long as you meet the eligibility requirements that are outlined in their program funding, then you are eligible to apply for that specific funding. I am going to pause just for a second as we talk about funding eligibility to see if there's any questions so far.
We get a copy of the panel. Okay.
And we don't have any questions in the chat, but you're all welcome to put them there if that's easier for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. Okay, I'm going to keep going. All right, just basic overview of our funding process. Though there might be some changes for each funding round, this is a basic way that each of our funding process works. And we try to be, as you'll hear me say it over and over again, objective, transparent as possible. And so though it feels a little bit bureaucratic, it is the process that works best for us to make sure that we have a competitive and transparent process to the way that we make funding decisions. So when we have funding that we are trying to allocate in the community or make determinations on, you will always see a notice of funding come out. The notice of funding comes out in multiple different ways, but it is posted in as far-reaching as we can make it. So we create a notice of funding, which is going to outline what the funding is, how much it's for, how you apply, what projects are eligible, and a timeline for how to supply, for when you should be applying and what that process decisions would look like. Accompanied with that notice of funding are the applications and scoring sheets. So we give you right up front what questions you're going to be asked and how we're going to score you. All of these information are usually posted on our website, sent out to all of our CoC members, shared on social media, and probably sent out through a MailChimp like news blast to all of the people who are on our mailing list. So we try to put it out in as many places as possible. We set a deadline for when projects have to apply. For the last couple of years, we have been using an electronic application system. We were doing them on paper for a very long time, which was an administrative nightmare. So we have actually changed to an electronic system. So GWRC has their own application process that you submit everything online, comes right to us. One of the key things, though, is there is a strong deadline on project applications. If you do not submit on time, that submit button goes away and you will no longer be eligible to submit. So I encourage you to be timely. We have had people who are right at the end of their project applications and did not hit submit in time, and therefore were not eligible to apply. So we take away all feedback for being able to accept a late application. It's just not even allowed to be submitted. What happens once we receive those is the CoC staff actually puts together a packet for the Funding and Performance Committee. They will review each of the applications and score them individually using the approved scoring sheet. So they will have usually about a week to review the applications, read them over, and make scoring. From there, they will have a meeting and come together to create one individualized scoring sheet. So you will never see the individual member scores. You will always only see the collaborative effort of the committee to come up with a final score for your application. Once they come up with a final score for each application, they have a discussion about what that means. And so there's a couple of steps to that. The funding committee will then figure out if they will accept or reject an application. For all accepted applications, they will determine an amount that is accepted. So what that means is you submit an application, we score it, they have a conversation about whether or not it's something that will even be included in this collaborative application that the CoC will submit for funding. And then from there, it will determine an amount. So even though you ask for, let's say, $100,000, there might be some line items in there that they don't agree with, and they could reduce that funding, let's say, to $80,000. Once they have determined which projects will be accepted and at what amount, they then rank projects in order of priority. Traditionally, they have thought about this in a couple of different ways. It's really hard for them to think through how you compare an emergency shelter project to a housing project, or a shelter project to a street outreach project, right? So they have really thought through what the system needs to function, what the bare minimums are, and make those the priorities first, and then they go from there. But they take lots of things into consideration when they do that, which is the overall strategy, the score of the project, the ability of the applicant to actually carry out the funds, what the regional impact might be, and other kind of extenuating factors. So they take lots of things into consideration and come up with a ranking. Once all of that is done, their process is finished for the most part. We put all the information for each of the projects into a letter, and each project gets a letter on whether or not they were accepted, at what amount, and how they ranked. So really transparent about what the overall process was. Each of our projects also receive their collaborative scoring sheet, so they can see exactly how they got the score that they did and where they lost points, so that they could make stronger applications in the future. Also in that letter, we give information about appeals process. So we have an appeals process for every single one of our funding applications. And once that is open, it's usually a very short turnaround, usually about 2 to 3 days. And you can appeal for things like you feel like you were left out of the process when you shouldn't have been, scores were not accurate, or there was something in your application that you think was biased. We do not take into consideration new information. We do not take in consideration that you feel like you should have gotten more money than you did. Those are things that are not eligible for an appeal, but something that has to do with the overall process of the funding application we do. Once that appeals process is closed, we send out a final determination of funding that's been approved by the board, and we post all of our project applications and the collaborative applications to our website for public review. So the CoC review committee is not the only one who sees your project application. We put those on our website for everyone to review each individual project as well as the overarching application that will be submitted by the CoC. So that's our overall process. Is there any questions thus far about the process itself? Okay.
We're still looking good in the chat, Sam.
Okay, great. All right, so at this point, we're going to go through certain federal funding opportunities and what those look like. So our biggest federal funding is the HUD CoC program. So this program's goals is really about getting funding for homeless services into community. This has been around for a very long time. They switched to a collaborative application process back in 2008. And projects that are currently eligible for funding through this program are permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, supportive services only project, so that's usually our coordinated entry system, and then the HMIS lead is eligible to apply for HMIS projects. Usually we expect this application to come out in about July to August is when they release it, which would make applications due to us and to HUD around September or October depending. We usually have about 90 days to get an application together. Last year it was a lot shorter of a turnaround, but usually I anticipate about 90 days. Awards are usually made in March. We actually just heard this week about our HUD awards from last year's application. So I'm standing true to this estimate. But these are the projects that we are looking at. The joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, I think, is the most interesting one. This is the only funding source that you will see that funds transitional housing in any way. So joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing is a project that offers both of those components, but tries to get people out of shelter as quickly as possible still. So even though that they know that certain populations such as mental health, DV, or youth may need longer than shelter than what is average thought for people in shelter, which is at 90 days. You can still offer rapid rehousing and try to get them out as quickly as possible, though they know that they might need some extra time in shelter. So that's a really interesting project. The other ones are, you'll hear over and over again that there are some funding sources federally and statewide that support those, but that's probably the most interesting one. Just a little bit about what kind of money we're talking about with the CoC program. So I looked at last year's numbers and updated these for you so that you could see what they look like. We traditionally have been the most underfunded CoC in the state. We actually received the lowest amount of HUD funding. It is based on our population, and I'm not 100% sure how the funding started at the level that it did, but that's where we are. When I started, we actually only received $336,000 from HUD funding. This last award, we received $536,000. So we've increased it over $200,000 in the last 4 years that I've been with the CoC, but just know it is a very small pot of money if you're looking at what HUD gives to the rest of the state. Anyway, we have usually about $440,000 in renewal funds, or funds that can be reallocated to new projects. So that's the pot. They don't dictate it to which project they go to. It doesn't have to go to renewal projects, but that's how much money we are able to re-ask for each year. And it's based on what's funded the previous year. They always offer a bonus funds. Usually these have been geared towards permanent housing projects, though last year there was not a stipulation for that. And it has always hovered about $25,000. For the last 3 years, we have also been eligible for domestic violence bonus. Last year's bonus for us was $50,000. And so the exciting thing for us as we continue to grow money is, as long as we are eligible for these bonus projects and we receive them, then our renewal amount each year will continue to grow. So this current round that was just announced, these are the numbers here. Current funded projects are HMIS. We have about $55,000 for us to staff our HMIS system here at GWRC. $15,000 in planning, so running the CoC for $15,000. Micah gets about $300,000 in PSH funds between 2 projects, and then Empower House has been running rapid rehousing services, and with their latest amount is now up to $150,000 for that program. And how that project works is same as what we talked about. You're going to apply, they're going to review, and then they're going to rank. Now, the weird thing about the CoC program is they tell us very clearly how much money we can apply for up front. That does not happen with other sources of funding, that they tell us exactly how much money we can apply for upfront. So we actually have a very complicated ranking system when it comes to HUD. We still rank in order, highest priority to lowest priority, but they end up falling in 2 tiers. So I'm going to try and make it as easy to understand as possible. Just know you don't have to fully understand it. We continue to have how to apply webinars when each funding source comes out, and we'll go over it over and over again. But tier 1 is 94% of that annual renewal amount. So that 444% falls, 94% of that falls in tier 1. So these are going to be projects that pass eligibility and threshold review, and then they're conditionally selected from the highest scoring CoCs to the lowest scoring. So we rank all our projects and we have a cutoff based on amount. For tier 2, in order to be funded by HUD, they have a very complicated scoring process. There's a little bit from your CoC application score, a little bit from your CoC ranking, and then low barriers to entry. If there is a tie across the country, then your CoC score is going to win out, and then finally your CoC performance ratings. I think the thing that's you have to be clear on here is HUD, you are competing against every other community in the country for funding, where some of the other ones you're not. But like I said, very complicated tier process. But they said if your project falls in tier 1, we consider you funded. If you fall in tier 2, we consider that not at risk or at risk of not being funded at all. So there is that. Just a little bit of idea about what comes with HUD funding. And we have some HUD funded folks on the call, and they'd be happy to talk to you about the pros and cons of HUD funding. But there is a 25% match requirement, so you do have to come up with some kind of match that is not allocated to another grant in order to match your HUD funding. There is HUD reporting. There is an annual report that you do each year called an APR for your HUD dollars. And then finally, there's the federal remittance report process, which can be complicated first time round. To get set up in the system, get your first month's remittance in, get all your backup documentation. But after that, once you're approved for your first month, it is automatic payments. They no longer do all document review for each month. It's a direct deposit and just gets automatically accepted once submitted. So once you make it through that first month, which can be really hard, you're good to go. And that would be redone each year as you receive the fund. So that is HUD program funding. I'm going to pause for just a second to see if there's any questions about HUD funding in particular.
I have a question, Sam.
Yeah.
This is Jacob from Fahas.
Yeah.
If I'm searching for grants independently and I come across a housing grant from HUD, would it be a good idea to contact you first before applying that, the CoC that is, or how does that work out? Because I wouldn't want to apply for a HUD grant that the CoC is applying for.
Yeah, so for this grant, the only way to apply is through the CoC.
I
If,
was mentioning like grants in general. I apologize.
yeah.
Not the specific one.
Yeah, so grants in general, we love to have collaboration on grants and know about what funding is being applied for in the community. I think in particular, and what we can talk about this at the end of what GWRC sees their role as in the funding process, but we see ourselves as providing technical assistance through a funding process, either through ours or in general to receive homeless dollars, right? So we want to be supportive of you. If there's ever a need for a support letter for other funding sources, we can provide those. We have reviewed applications, so we're able to read your applications and help make them as strong as possible. And then we provide data. So if there's ever any data about homeless services that you need. So if it's a process outside of the CoC, it's not something that we're the applicant for, then we want to support you in those. So yes, I would always say reach out to us because of our relationship with HUD and just through their grants process. We want to be able to make you as competitive as possible, whether independently or through one of our processes.
Thank you so much. I didn't kind of realize the CoC was a resource in that way, and I would definitely be contacting you. Thanks again.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. We're going to move on to state funding. Our biggest pot of state funding is the Virginia Homeless Solutions Program funding, VHSP. This funds a whole bunch of different projects, and mostly this funding source is looking at trying to make sure that homeless systems are in our community. So there's a big emphasis on how projects fit into the system when it comes to state funding, in particular the VHSP funding. So eligible projects, street outreach. So anything that helps people who would otherwise not seek services on their own get to services is street outreach. Coordinate assessment. So mostly this funds the helpline and things like that, but how people get connected to services and get prioritized in a strategic way. Targeted prevention. So how we prevent people's episodes of homelessness through case management and subsidies in order to stop them from ever becoming homeless. Emergency shelter, rapid rehousing. You'll notice permanent supportive housing is not an eligible project under VHSP. Traditionally, that has been the HUD CoC program or Housing Trust Fund, which we'll talk next. And then outside, so those are our main project funding. Then outside of that, you get some complicated math happening, but 10% of the total project funding, so anything that's applied for through 1 through 5, 10% of that amount can go towards CoC planning, 5% of that amount can go towards HMIS projects, and 5% can go towards admin. Usually those applications are due around March. These are on a 2-year grant cycle, and so that moves each year, but usually comes out and are due around March, and we receive awards in May for grants to start in July. Like I said, 2-year grant cycle. Year 1, you apply for any amount, and any community allocation is awarded after applications are submitted. So basically we tell the state, what do we need to fully fund our system? So it can be an astronomical amount. It can be any amount at all. They do not tell us how much we can apply for up front like HUD does. So we apply for anything we want. In year 2, the only people who are eligible to apply for VHSP funding are those that were funded in year 1. So for this year, you will see probably in the next month or so a VHSP notice of funding coming out. And that will be a renewal year. So only those who are currently receiving VHSP dollars will be able to apply this year, but in 2024, new applicants will be eligible to apply. All of that information will be in the notice of funding about who's eligible to apply, but just to give you an idea about where we currently are in that funding process. Things that we are currently funding is we currently fund about $72,000 for coordinated assessment to help our helpline, $180,000 for prevention services, that's with Lois Ann's Hope House, $117,000 in emergency shelter, that's Micah, Hope House, and Empower House. Almost $900,000 in rapid rehousing between Lois Ann's Hope House, Empower House, and Micah. GWRC is the only one eligible to apply for COC funding. We receive about $50,000. HMIS funds are used for both staffing and license fees for our HMIS process across all of our providers. We have about $40,000 there, and then a small amount of admin. We are not maxed out at those percentages in our community, so there is some flexibility there. Anyway, overall, we receive about $1 million in VHSP funds. Part of this application process, and this is key for especially Kathy and Jacob, is HOPWA is included in this fund in a small portion. I think just one of our counties, but that is not included in these numbers. You receive a separate allocation in HOPWA, but it is submitted through this application process. So we work together through that process to get you guys HOPWA funding. Some overall state requirements for VHSP funding. Again, that 25% match. VHSP has a very interesting match process though, where HUD wants to see match dollars either in kind or in cash that directly go towards your project. VHSP, you are actually able to have a 25% match across the community in any project funding eligible source. So what that means is even though traditionally we have not had street outreach be funded through VHSP, if you have street outreach dollars in your community that you can match towards your overall community allocation, then you can do that. It's very weird, but basically what it means is if for some reason an individual organization is not able to match that 25%, we are able to ask other people in the community to match that for us. But it's basically they want to see that at least 25% of the amount that comes to the community is going back into the community system overall. There is VHSP reporting. There are 2 annual reports that happen each year in 6-month increments. And HMIS is required for that reporting. And then there's a state remittance process. It's a monthly submission in their grants management system, and then an approval process from there. It is not an automatic approval like HUD's is, so it does go through an approval process that takes at least 90 days, or excuse me, 30 days for each remittance submission. All right, any questions on VHSP? All right, we're going to move to Housing Trust Fund. Housing Trust Fund has been a complicated shift over and over again, but I'm going to give you what I know so far about Housing Trust Fund. So Housing Trust Fund is a fund in the community at a state level that has 2 sources to it. A affordable construction source, as well as a homeless reduction source. And we'll talk through what each of those means and what the numbers look like, but we're going to focus on applying specifically for the homeless reduction source. We have nothing to do with the construction source mostly. Okay, so for Housing Trust Fund, you're eligible to apply for rapid rehousing, underserved population innovation grants. And these are an interesting one. They have looked at how to be flexible with those populations that are underserved, but may not meet the homeless definition as easily. I think youth is a great example of that. Many times we can't find homeless youth that meet the HUD definition of homeless because they don't live outside. They couch hop, right? And because you couch hop, you're temporarily staying with family and you never actually become homeless. So that's a great option. The innovation project can fund anything from outreach to planning, host homes, any other projects services wise that would support the experience of underserved populations. Housing Trust Fund a couple of years ago started to allow for permanent supportive housing. Before that, HUD was the only source for permanent supportive housing for us, and now we've gotten quite a bit of money from Housing Trust Fund to support permanent supportive housing. It does allow for HMIS fees and administrative costs. The way in which you have applied for this fund has fluctuated over the last year or so. Last year, they had you apply for rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects through the collaborative VHSP process. The Underserved Populations Innovation Project was in a separate process, but for the rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects, you actually applied through VHSP. My understanding is they're doing away with that this year, so it will be a separate grant application again this year. Usually those come out around the tail end of summer. They're due around November, and awards are made around January or February. I think one of the biggest downfalls to know about this project is it is on a calendar year versus a state fiscal year. And yes, it still says awards are made January or February. We have traditionally over the last couple of years had awards come out after the grant had already started, and it becomes a complicated thing. But it has a lot to do with waiting on the governor to pass them and pass a budget in order for it to come out. They've been trying to work on getting a better process, but it hasn't really worked out that way. But even though it's not a process that we apply for directly, we do play a key role in it. So we're going to go through that a little bit, but Housing Trust Fund is a project, an individual agency application. The CoC does not do a collaborative application in the same way outside of what we did in the VHSP process last year. But there is a requirement for a CoC letter of support in order to apply to DHCD for these funds. So that's why collaboration with the CoC in the development of your project is still very key to be able to get this funding. Overall, it's about $30 million a year. About 60% of those goes towards the cost of homeownership and rental housing, and then 40 of them is targeted towards reducing homelessness. We received allocations, I think, late last month, and we got 4 projects funded, totaling about $777,000. It's the most money and the most projects we've ever received from Housing Trust Fund. But it's a permanent supportive housing project for MICA, a rapid rehousing project for MICA, and a health innovation project for MICA. Health innovation is under that underserved innovation grant. It provides basic health care needs to those experiencing homelessness. So primary care, doctors, gynecology, oncology, and home health, actually. And then newly this year, Lois Ann's Hope House has a rapid rehousing project in there. So for us, like I said, the project must be developed with the CoC. We have to have a collaborative role. Particularly, we have had people who are interested in Housing Trust Fund submit their project scope to us. We review their project applications before it goes in and provide data. And then we actually provide that letter of support, which is required for all applications. The agency still applies directly, not through the CoC. So the agency applies to DHCD for these funds. The CoC will review applications in case there's lots of people who want to apply, which ones we want to give a letter of support for. Something to keep in mind is that there is Housing Trust Fund reporting and the state remittance process. Any questions on Housing Trust Fund? All right. Last one I'm going to talk about is local funding. We are having more and more processes come through, small local funding processes. I think the ones we have right now is we partner with United Way for a little bit of funding for the helpline. Traditionally, that has not been through an application process in the community because there's only one person who runs our helpline. We partner with the hospital for community eligibility. That also probably needs to be on a application process, but we've just had one provider kind of step up and take that on from another provider. And then Unsheltered Homelessness Initiative has been our longest ongoing project. It's really restrictive about how funds can be used. So it's a rapid rehousing project. We choose an administrator of those funds over a 2-year grant cycle. The funding varies from each year depending on what the localities pay into the fund. Traditionally, it's been about, we've gotten it up to $30,000 in local funding, supported by all of our jurisdictions except Spotsylvania, but it's a little bit of funds in order to move people in directly from the street to housing. And so for this project, it is the administrator completely partners with GWRC for funding. You apply to GWRC, we select an administrator, and then we actually do your remittance process and reporting. So we report to the city and the other localities on the outcomes of these projects. You submit remittances to me, and I get you a check, but we get a lump sum from the localities in order to fund these projects. Usually this project can serve about 6 people a year. But it's an ongoing kind of thing. So I'm going to pause just for a minute to take any questions that you might have, but I do just want to again reiterate how quick these processes are. Our process for funding is a blip in time when I look back on it. We usually give about 14 days for people to submit an application from the time that the project application gets released to the time that the applications are due. And that's why I, again, keep reiterating how important it is to talk to the CoC about what your projects are and what you're trying to get done in the community. We're here as a resource, as Jacob had asked. We're here as a resource. Tell us what your project ideas are. We can help you figure out what funding options are for you. We can help you review your applications to make them as competitive as possible. We can provide you with data in order to make sure that you're having accurate numbers going through. We can be here as a technical support through the process. And then for our processes, you know, we're here to support in any way that we can to make them as competitive and transparent as possible. But lots of that can't happen within 14 days when you're trying to submit an application. So collaborate and collaborate early to help us know what your projects are so that when an application comes out, you are ready to submit a project and a strong project of that. But I'm going to pause now. That goes through all of our funding process, all of our funding sources that we have a large hand in. But I'm here for any questions.
Sam, it's Kathy from Fahas. I know last time the Housing Trust Fund was concentrating on youth, veterans, and over 55 populations. Do we have any idea if that's still the breakdown for those innovative projects this year?
Yeah, so when Housing Trust Fund first came out towards homelessness, you're right, there was a priority for youth and elderly. I think they have done away with those bonus project points for that population, and it's really just tell us what underserved population you want to go for. So I don't think that there have been those bonus points for a specific population, I think in the last 2 years.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
As an aside, if anyone comes up with any questions after this presentation, y'all are more than welcome to schedule time with either Sam or myself. We're happy to sit down and, you know, just chew through this with you. So if something comes up after our presentation, feel free to reach out.
All right. If I hear no other questions, Erica did record this for us, so this will be available on our website for you to review. I know there's a lot of information in there. Again, if there's something you're interested in, please just reach out to us. We want to make you as competitive for funding as possible. We pride ourselves on having a very strong CoC across our state and across the country, actually. So we want to be as collaborative as possible, and you don't have to do funding on your own, especially if it's going towards something that's homeless related. We're here to support you and provide that technical assistance. I think we haven't done a great job at advertising ourselves as a resource for funding in the community, to Jacob's point. And so we want people to know that we're here to support you any way that we can, whether it's through our funding or some other funding. But we have capacity support to support you guys in getting funding for your projects. So help us help you by telling us what you need.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
All right.